Learn English through story. The final witness. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that carried weight rather than peace. The city, though vast and restless, seemed to hush itself in the presence of something unseen, something watching. Miles Carter had spent years navigating these streets, but tonight they felt foreign to him. The air smelled of wet pavement, of old secrets stirred by the evening rain. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and kept walking, his mind occupied with thoughts he wished he could forget. At 47, Miles had lived long enough to know that truth was never simple. It was layered, like the peeling paint on an abandoned building, revealing different shades with every scrape. He had built his career on unraveling the truth, once as a journalist, later as a private investigator. And yet, for all his efforts, for all the lies he had uncovered, it was the truth he had ignored that now haunted him. A week ago, Eleanor Hayes had been found dead in her apartment. The police had ruled it a suicide, but Miles knew better. Eleanor was a woman who had fought too hard to simply give up. She had once been a fearless investigative reporter, uncovering corruption in the highest places. And Miles had admired her, perhaps even loved her, in a way he never admitted. But now she was gone, and with her, the final piece of a story she had been trying to tell. The story had started months ago, when Eleanor reached out to him after years of silence. Her voice had been urgent, edged with fear. "Miles, I need to talk. I'm onto something big, but I don't know who to trust. Meet me tomorrow at the old train station." That meeting had never happened. Instead, he had received a call informing him that she was dead. Miles had spent the past week combing through what little evidence he could find. Eleanor's notes were missing. Her apartment had been searched, poorly disguised as a robbery. The police had closed the case too quickly, too neatly. Someone wanted this buried, and they had succeeded. Except for one problem. Miles was still here, and he had the one thing they hadn't accounted for. Miles had been trailing Eleanor's research, trying to understand what she had been investigating. Corrupt politicians, corporate fraud, dirty money. Eleanor had a long list of enemies. But before she died, she had spoken to someone who knew what she had discovered. A single person left who had seen what she saw. Finding them was not going to be easy. In a city where silence was currency and fear was a weapon, people didn't talk unless they had to. And even then, they often ended up silenced before they could say too much. But Miles was not easily deterred. He had spent his life chasing ghosts, and he wasn't about to stop now. The search led him down familiar paths, old contacts who owed him favors, sources too afraid to speak, dead ends that felt deliberate. But then, a breakthrough. A name, Thea Lawson. She had worked with Eleanor on her last story. Though she had never been mentioned publicly, Eleanor had been protecting her. Now, Thea might be the only one left who could reveal the truth. Tracking her down wasn't difficult. Thea had vanished from her usual haunts. But Miles had his ways. He found her in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, her eyes filled with the kind of fear that had kept her alive. "I can't talk to you," she said the moment she opened the door. "You don't have a choice," Miles replied, stepping inside before she could shut him out. "Eleanor is dead." Thea's expression faltered. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I ran." "Then you know they'll find you eventually," Miles said. "Unless we stop them first." Thea hesitated, then sighed. She found something that could bring down powerful people. It wasn't just about corruption, it was about murder. Miles leaned in. "Tell me everything." And so the story began to unfold, one dark secret at a time. Thea paced the small room, her arms crossed over her chest. The dim yellow light of the motel lamp cast long shadows, making the place feel even smaller. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. Miles could see the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way her breath hitched every time a car passed outside. She was running on fear and adrenaline, and it was only a matter of time before one of them ran out. "You said Eleanor found something," Miles pressed, watching her carefully. What was it? Thea hesitated, biting her lower lip. She had the look of someone debating whether to jump into deep water, knowing there was no way back once she did. She called it the ledger, Thea finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. A record of every bribe, every cover-up, every deal made to keep certain people in power. It wasn't just financial corruption. People died because of what was in that ledger. Miles, if the truth ever came out. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. It would destroy careers, end lives. Miles felt his pulse quicken. A story like that was bigger than anything Eleanor had ever worked on. Bigger than anything he had ever worked on. He had spent years exposing fraud, scandals, lies, but this was something else entirely. Who did the ledger belong to? He asked. Thea swallowed hard. Jonathan Mercer. The name sent a chill through Miles. Jonathan Mercer wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. A billionaire with deep political ties. A man whose influence stretched into places most people never even knew existed. He controlled media outlets, law enforcement, judges. His empire was built on secrets, and anyone who got too close to exposing them had a habit of disappearing. Eleanor had proof. Miles asked. Thea nodded. She found someone inside Mercer's organization. A whistleblower. They gave her access to the ledger, but she never told me who they were. She wanted to protect them. Her voice wavered. She died for it, Miles, and now they're after me, too. Miles let the weight of that settle between them. He had suspected Eleanor's death wasn't an accident, but now he knew. Someone had killed her to keep the ledger buried, and Thea was next on their list. You still have a copy? Miles asked. Thea hesitated. I don't have the actual files, but I know where she hid them. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should retrieve them and go public. Where? Thea glanced toward the window, her paranoia evident. It's not that simple. It's in a safety deposit box, but Eleanor didn't trust banks. She used an offshore account to rent a box in a private vault downtown. No names, no paper trail. She only left one way to access it. Miles raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Thea reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Miles, her fingers still shaking. He unfolded it, scanning the words written in Eleanor's handwriting. The answer is always in the past. Find what we lost, and you'll find the key. Miles frowned. What does this mean? Thea let out a nervous breath. It's a riddle. Eleanor loved puzzles. She wouldn't make it easy. She told me once that if anything ever happened to her, the truth would be hidden in the last place anyone would think to look. Miles' mind was already working, turning over possibilities. Eleanor had been careful, methodical. She wouldn't have left the ledger unprotected, but she also wouldn't have left it somewhere impossible to retrieve. What did Eleanor lose? Miles asked. Thea's expression darkened. Her sister. A cold realization settled over him. Eleanor's younger sister, Claire, had vanished nearly 20 years ago. It had been one of those cases that faded into nothing, no leads, no closure. Eleanor never stopped looking for her, but over time, even she had begun to accept that Claire was gone. You think she connected Claire's disappearance to this? Miles asked. I don't know, Thea admitted. But if that's the clue she left us, then it has to mean something. Miles exhaled slowly. Then we start there. The search led them through Eleanor's old records. Newspaper clippings, notes she had kept on Claire's case over the years. It was clear that even decades later, she had never given up. There were timelines, suspect lists, theories all meticulously documented. And then Miles found it. Tucked inside a worn-out folder was a photograph of Claire, taken just weeks before she disappeared. On the back, Eleanor had scribbled something in red ink. One day, the truth will matter. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as Miles flipped through more of Eleanor's notes, something clicked. A name kept appearing in her records. A man named Vincent Holloway. Thea frowned when Miles pointed it out. Who's that? A former detective, Miles said. He was assigned to Claire's case, but he retired years ago. Thea looked uneasy. Do you think Eleanor was onto something about him? Only one way to find out, Miles said. Tracking Holloway down was easier than expected. He lived in a quiet neighborhood, his house modest but well kept. When Miles and Thea knocked, it took a long moment before the door creaked open. The man who stood before them was in his 60s, with tired eyes and a face that had seen too much. He studied them carefully before speaking. I was wondering when someone would come asking about Eleanor, he said. Miles and Thea exchanged a glance. You knew her? Miles asked. Holloway nodded slowly. She came to me a few months ago. Wanted to know everything I remembered about Claire's case. He exhaled. She was getting close to something. Too close. Miles felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? Holloway hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in. If I tell you this, you need to understand there's no turning back. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and dust. Holloway led them to a small living room, where stacks of old case files sat untouched. He sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. I covered up Claire's disappearance, he said finally, his voice heavy with guilt. Thea gasped. What? I didn't have a choice, Holloway continued. Back then, I was just a detective, but Mercer already had power. He had people on the inside. Claire found out something she shouldn't have. She tried to expose it. He swallowed hard, and then she vanished. Miles felt a slow, cold anger building inside him. Mercer was behind it. Holloway nodded. Eleanor figured it out. That's why they killed her. But she was smart. She left the evidence somewhere she knew Mercer couldn't reach. Miles leaned forward. Where? Holloway sighed. In Claire's case file. The original, unredacted version. The only copy that still exists. Miles' mind was racing. If Eleanor had hidden the truth there, it meant the final witness to Mercer's crimes had been in plain sight all along. And now, the question was, could they get to it before Mercer did? Miles felt the weight of Holloway's words settle over him like a thick fog. The revelation that Claire had been silenced because she had uncovered something damning about Mercer wasn't just a missing piece of the puzzle. It was the very foundation of everything Eleanor had been trying to prove. The ledger, the cover-ups, the bribes, the murders, all of it tied back to one undeniable fact. Claire had been the first witness, and Eleanor had been the last. And now, it was up to Miles and Thea to become the final witnesses. Holloway sat back, rubbing a hand over his tired face. The original case file, he said slowly. It's not supposed to exist anymore. When I was ordered to cover it up, I did what I was told. I altered the official records, erased evidence, buried anything that could lead back to Mercer. But he hesitated. I couldn't destroy everything. Miles narrowed his eyes. You kept the copy. Holloway exhaled sharply. Not exactly. I hid the real file where no one would think to look inside another case. One that had already been sealed years before Claire disappeared. A case so buried in the system that even Mercer's people wouldn't know where to find it. Thea leaned forward, her pulse visibly racing. Where? Holloway hesitated. The cold case archives, downtown, third sub-basement level. Restricted access. Miles felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly what that meant. The cold case archives were a bureaucratic labyrinth, a place where unsolved cases went to die. Only law enforcement personnel could access the deeper levels, and even then, only with the right clearance. The files were stored in paper form, away from digital networks, making them nearly impossible to hack or retrieve remotely. How do we get in? Thea asked. Holloway sighed. That's the problem. Security's tight, and with Mercer's influence, any unauthorized access would set off alarms. He hesitated before adding, there's only one way. You need someone on the inside. Miles crossed his arms. Do you know anyone who can help? A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Holloway shook his head. Most of the people I trusted are either gone or on Mercer's payroll. Thea looked at Miles. What about you? You have contacts in the department, don't you? Miles hesitated. He did. But the one person he was thinking of was someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who might not even be willing to help. Detective Sarah Whitmore. She had been one of the few honest cops left when Miles was still working as a journalist. They had crossed paths more times than he could count, often helping each other in ways that weren't exactly by the book. But their relationship had soured when Miles walked away from reporting, choosing to become a private investigator instead. She had called him a sellout. He had called her naive for believing the system could still be fixed. Now, he needed her more than ever. Miles stood up. I'll handle it. Holloway gave him a knowing look. Be careful. If she's been compromised, you'll be walking straight into Mercer's hands. Miles nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll find out soon enough. Thea waited in the car while Miles walked into the precinct. His pulse steady but his mind racing. He knew better than to call Sarah and give her time to think. She would have refused outright. Instead, he had come in person, knowing that if he could just get a moment alone with her, he might have a chance. He found her at her desk, hunched over paperwork, her short auburn hair tucked behind her ears. She looked up when she saw him, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. You've got to be kidding me, she muttered. Of all the people. Sarah, Miles cut in, lowering his voice. I need your help. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Last time you needed my help, you left me to deal with the fallout. Why should I even listen to you? Because Eleanor Hayes is dead, Miles said. And I know why. That got her attention. The irritation faded from her eyes, replaced by something colder. Keep talking. Miles leaned in. She found something that could take down Mercer, a ledger. It's hidden in a file inside the cold case archives. He paused, lowering his voice even further. The real file on Claire Hayes. Sarah stiffened. Claire Hayes. The missing girl from 20 years ago. Not missing, Miles corrected. Murdered. Covered up. And Mercer was behind it. Sarah's face was unreadable, but Miles saw the subtle shift in her posture. She wasn't dismissing him. She was thinking, weighing the risk. Finally, she exhaled. You realize what you're asking me to do. If I help you, and Mercer finds out, I'm dead. We all are. Miles nodded. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't worth the risk. Sarah studied him for a long moment before cursing under her breath. Damn it, Miles. You never know when to quit. A hint of a smile touched his lips. That's why you liked me, remember? She rolled her eyes. I'm going to regret this. But she was already standing, grabbing her jacket. Let's go before I change my mind. Breaking into the cold case archives wasn't the hard part. Getting out alive was. Sarah used her badge to get them past the first security points, flashing her credentials like she had every right to be there. But the third checkpoint, the sub-basement, required an access code. And Mercer's people had made sure only a handful of trusted officers had it. We don't have clearance, Thea whispered, glancing nervously at the security camera above them. What now? Sarah sighed. Now we improvise. Before Miles could stop her, she strode up to the officer at the desk, a middle-aged man with a beer belly and tired eyes. Hey, Don, she said casually. The officer looked up, frowning. Whitmore, what the hell are you doing down here? Sarah leaned in. Listen, I need a quick look at an old case file. Just a routine follow-up, but I forgot my code. Can you let me through? Don hesitated. I don't know. Things have been tight lately. Mercer's been breathing down our necks about restricted files. Sarah sighed dramatically. Come on, Don. You know me. I'll be in and out in 5 minutes. Don wavered. Then, finally, he grumbled. Fine, but if anyone asks, I didn't see you. He punched in the code. The door clicked open. Sarah winked. You're a lifesaver, Don. They stepped through quickly, not daring to look back. The room was colder than expected, rows of filing cabinets stretching into the darkness. Miles pulled out a flashlight and scanned the labels. Then he saw it. Case No. 1127 Claire Hayes. His hands felt strangely steady as he opened the drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder. Inside, neatly stacked, were documents that had been buried for decades, reports, witness statements, crime scene photos, and, tucked between the pages, a flash drive. Miles exhaled. "We found it." But before they could celebrate, a voice echoed from the doorway. "Step away from the file, now." They turned slowly. Two men in dark suits, guns raised, Mercer's men. And just like that, the hunt for the final witness had come full circle. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the archives was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, but the tension was suffocating. The two men standing in the doorway, Mercer's enforcers, had the cold, detached expressions of men who had done this before. "Step away from the file," the taller one repeated, his voice steady. "Now." Miles slowly raised his hands, glancing at Thea and Sarah. Thea's eyes darted between the flash drive and the gun pointed at her. Sarah, ever the cop, was calculating angles, escape routes. But none of them had the upper hand. "Look," Miles said carefully, "we don't have to do this. You know as well as I do that Mercer doesn't need more blood on his hands." The second man, a starky figure with a scar running down his cheek, let out a short laugh. "You think this is about need? You're a loose end, still. So is the girl. And now Whitmore, too." He shook his head. "You should have just walked away." Miles' mind raced. They were boxed in, but if there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was that people with power like Mercer's often underestimated the chaos of a desperate man. And right now, he was desperate. His fingers flexed slightly, brushing against the edge of the file. He could feel the weight of the flash drive inside. A small but undeniable piece of truth. If they got out of here, they had everything they needed to bring Mercer down. You know what's funny?" Miles said, forcing a smirk. "Mercer sent you here to clean this up, but he didn't think about one little problem." Scarface narrowed his eyes. "What problem?" Miles nodded at the security camera above them. "The feed. Someone's watching, which means if you shoot us, it's all on record." The taller man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the camera. That hesitation was all Sarah needed. In a blur of motion, she grabbed a metal filing box from the nearest shelf and hurled it at Scarface's head. It struck with a dull thud, sending him staggering back. The taller man raised his gun, but Miles was already moving. He lunged, grabbing the nearest shelf and yanking it forward with all his strength. The heavy metal structure tilted, toppling over with a deafening crash. Papers exploded into the air, filling the room with a blizzard of documents as the shelves collapsed like dominoes. Thea screamed as she ducked, and Sarah yanked her away just as a second shelf came crashing down. Miles hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. Somewhere in the chaos, a gun went off, 2 shots, muffled by the falling cabinets. Then silence. Dust swirled in the dim light, and for a moment, all Miles could hear was his own ragged breathing. He pushed himself up, wincing. The taller man was out cold, buried under a pile of metal and paper. Scarface groaned, trying to move, but Sarah was already on him. She kicked his gun away and pressed her knee into his chest. "Don't," she warned, breathing hard. Scarface glared at her but didn't resist. Miles turned to Thea. "Are you okay?" She nodded shakily, clutching the flash drive. "We need to get out of here, now." Sarah stood, keeping her gun trained on Scarface. "We can't go through the main exit. Mercer's men will be swarming this place in minutes." Miles thought fast. "There's a service tunnel in the basement. It leads to the parking garage." Sarah nodded. "Then let's move." They stepped over the wreckage, leaving Scarface groaning on the floor. But before they reached the door, he called out, "You think this ends here?" His voice was hoarse but laced with amusement. You think Mercer doesn't already know what you've got? Miles didn't look back. If he didn't before, he does now. And with that, they ran. The tunnel was dark, damp, and smelled of mildew. It had been years since Miles had last used it back, when he was still an investigative journalist chasing stories that put him in places he wasn't supposed to be. They moved fast, their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Sarah led the way, her gun still drawn, while Thea clutched the flash drive like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Miles' mind raced. They had the evidence, but that wasn't the hard part. Exposing Mercer, really exposing him, meant getting it into the right hands. And that was the problem. Thea, Miles said as they ran. Who do you trust in the media? Thea hesitated. No one. Miles clenched his jaw. He understood why. Eleanor had been a journalist, and she had died for it. Mercer had people everywhere, editors, producers, publishers. If they handed the story to the wrong person, it would disappear, just like Eleanor. Then we don't go to the media, Sarah said. Miles frowned. Then who? Before she could answer, a loud clang echoed through the tunnel. They skidded to a stop. Ahead of them, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Jonathan Mercer. He stood with the calm confidence of a man who had already won. Dressed in an immaculate dark suit, his silver hair slicked back. He barely even glanced at the gun in Sarah's hand. Behind him, two more men emerged, both armed. You should have walked away, still, Mercer said. His voice smooth, almost disappointed. I really hoped you would. Miles took a slow breath. Eleanor didn't walk away. Neither did Claire. I'm just finishing what they started. Mercer shook his head. Such a shame. You had potential once. Miles tightened his grip on the flash drive. And you had a soul once. I think we both know which one of us made the bigger mistake. Mercer's expression darkened. He gave a slight nod to his men. Kill them. Gunfire erupted. Sarah fired first, dropping one of Mercer's guards with a clean shot to the leg. Thea ducked, screaming as bullets ricocheted off the tunnel walls. Miles grabbed her, pulling her behind a concrete barrier. Sarah took cover, reloading fast. We're pinned, she yelled. Miles' mind raced. The tunnel led to the parking garage. If they could just make it. Then he saw it. A rusted emergency pipe running along the ceiling. He looked at Sarah. Cover me. She didn't ask questions. She popped up, firing 3 quick shots, forcing Mercer's remaining man to duck. Miles jumped, grabbing the pipe with both hands. It groaned under his weight. Mercer turned just as Miles swung forward and kicked him square in the chest. The impact sent Mercer sprawling, hitting the ground hard. His gun clattered away. Sarah moved fast, disarming the last guard with a brutal kick to the wrist. He went down, groaning in pain. Then there was only Mercer, staring up at them, breathless. For the first time, Miles saw something in his eyes that wasn't confidence. It was fear. Thea stepped forward, holding up the flash drive. It's over, she said, her voice steady. Mercer exhaled, a bitter smile curling his lips. You think this changes anything? Miles met his gaze. Yeah, I do. And with that, they walked away. The tunnel opened into the lower levels of an underground parking garage, its fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Miles and Thea ran, their footsteps echoing as Sarah followed behind, her gun still clenched tightly. Miles' mind was racing. They had the evidence proof of Mercer's crimes, the cover-ups, the murders. But now they had to get out alive. Thea turned to him, her voice breathless. Where do we go now? We can't just walk into a police station. Mercer owns half the force. Sarah nodded grimly. And the other half is too afraid to take him down. Miles exhaled sharply. Then we don't go to the police. We go public. Thea looked at him in disbelief. Public, with Mercer's reach. He'll have this buried before it even airs. Not if we make sure it can't be buried, Miles said. We don't just send this to one place. We send it to everyone. Sarah frowned. That's risky. If he realizes what we're doing before it spreads, he'll come after us with everything he has left. Miles met her gaze. Then we better move fast. They reached Sarah's car, a nondescript sedan tucked in the corner of the garage. As soon as they got in, she peeled out, speeding toward the exit. The silence in the car was heavy. Miles turned to Thea. We need safe access to the internet somewhere secure, somewhere Mercer doesn't control. Thea bit her lip, thinking, my mother's old apartment. The lease is still in my name, but I haven't been there in years. No one knows about it. Sarah took the next turn hard. Then that's where we're going. Miles looked over his shoulder, scanning the road behind them. No headlights, no tail. But he knew Mercer wasn't done yet. The apartment was small, tucked away in a quiet part of the city. Dust coated the furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of abandonment. But Thea moved through it quickly, grabbing an old laptop from a closet. She booted it up, the dim screen casting eerie shadows across the room. Miles and Sarah stood behind her, watching as she plugged in the flash drive. The screen flickered. Then, rows of files appeared. Spreadsheets, bank transfers, names, dates, corruption woven into every line of data. Thea swallowed hard. This is it. Miles nodded. We need to copy it, send it out to as many places as we can, news agencies, government watchdogs, independent journalists. We flood the system. Sarah leaned in. I know someone in internal affairs. One of the few people I still trust. If this gets into the right hands, Mercer won't be able to cover it up. Thea's hands trembled slightly as she began typing. What if this isn't enough? What if Mercer finds a way to spin it? Miles placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. That's why we go beyond the data. Thea looked up at him. What do you mean? Miles exhaled. We give them something they can't ignore. A first-hand account. A witness statement. Yours. Thea froze. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. That's dangerous, Miles. I know, he admitted. But Mercer's been able to hide behind numbers, behind secrecy. If Thea steps forward, if she tells her mother's story, it makes this real. It forces people to pay attention. Thea's throat tightened. And puts a target on my back. Miles met her gaze. You already have one. Thea was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. An hour later, the files had been uploaded to multiple platforms, each one set to automatically release to the public. Thea had recorded a statement raw, emotional, undeniable. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her mother, about Claire, about the lives Mercer had destroyed. But there was strength in her words, a quiet determination that couldn't be silenced. Sarah's contact in internal affairs confirmed that the files were being reviewed. Investigations were already starting. It was done. And then, a noise outside. Miles' instincts kicked in. He moved fast, pulling Thea down just as the window shattered. A bullet embedded itself in the wall, where her head had been seconds ago. Go, 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 Sarah shouted, drawing her weapon. They sprinted for the back door, but heavy footsteps pounded up the stairwell. They were trapped. Miles grabbed Thea's hand, yanking her toward the only option left, the fire escape. Out the window. Sarah covered them as they climbed onto the rusted metal stairs, bullets whizzing past them. They moved fast, hearts pounding as they scrambled down. By the time they reached the alley, Mercer's men were already closing in. A black car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley. The back door opened. Jonathan Mercer stepped out. For a moment, no one moved. Mercer adjusted his cufflinks, his face unreadable. Then he spoke. You think you've won? His voice was quiet, almost amused. You think dumping some files online is enough to bring me down? Miles tightened his grip on Thea's arm, keeping her behind him. You're finished, Mercer? The whole city's watching now. Mercer tilted his head. Am I? Or will people forget in a week? A month? You overestimate how much the world cares. Thea stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. They will care. My mother's story, Claire's story, they matter. And you can't bury the truth forever. Mercer's eyes flicked to her. For the first time, something unreadable crossed his face. You're just like your mother, he said softly. No, Eve. Then he raised his hand. His men moved instantly. But before they could fire, sirens, blinding red and blue lights flooded the alley. Sarah smirked. Guess you do have a reason to be worried, Mercer. More cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, weapons raised. And at the front of them all, the head of internal affairs, Jonathan Mercer, the officer called, stepping forward. You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, obstruction of justice, and murder. Mercer's expression darkened. He didn't resist as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, but as he was led toward the waiting police car, he turned back to Miles. This isn't over, he said quietly. Men like me don't just disappear. Miles held his gaze. No, he admitted, but we make damn sure they never hold power again. Mercer was shoved into the car. The door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The files went viral. Thea's statement was broadcasted across every major news outlet. Protests erupted. Investigations deepened. And Mercer's empire collapsed. Thea stood at her mother's grave weeks later, the wind brushing against her skin. Miles stood beside her, silent. They finally know the truth, she murmured. Miles nodded. Because of you. Thea exhaled. Was it worth it? Miles hesitated. Then he smiled. The truth always is. And as they walked away, the weight of the past finally lifting, Thea realized. She wasn't just a witness to the truth. She was the one who made sure it could never be hidden again. 2 months later, the city was different. Not in the way that buildings had changed or streets had been renamed, but in the way people looked at each other. There was an undercurrent of awareness now. A shift in the way conversations sparked in cafes, in newsrooms, in City Hall. Mercer was gone. His empire had crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. But Thea had learned something in the past. Few months exposing corruption wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The trial was set to begin in 3 weeks, and the media circus surrounding it had only grown louder. Every major outlet was covering the case, dissecting Mercer's rise and fall, analysing the depths of his criminal web. Thea had spent weeks under protective custody, hidden away as law enforcement prepared their case. It hadn't been easy. Knowing Mercer was locked away didn't erase the fear that still lived inside her, nor did it bring back the people she had lost. But it did give her something new, a purpose. Miles sat in front of his laptop, staring at the blinking cursor. For years, his career as an investigative journalist had been in ruins. His reputation tarnished by Mercer's influence. But now, he had the biggest story of his life sitting in front of him. He had turned down every media request, every offer to sell his exclusive take on what had happened. He didn't trust them. This story wasn't about clicks or ratings. It was about justice. He exhaled, cracked his knuckles, and started typing. The truth was never easy to tell. It was never convenient. But the moment we stop telling it, the moment we let fears silence us, we become part of the corruption we once fought against. The words flowed, his fingers moving with purpose. By the time he finished, it was dawn. And for the first time in years, he felt like a journalist again. Thea sat across from Sarah in a quiet diner, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. You should leave town for a while, Sarah said bluntly, watching her closely. At least until the trial is over. Thea shook her head. I can't. I need to be here. Sarah sighed, leaning back. I get that. But Mercer still has people out there. You might have taken him down, but his influence didn't just vanish overnight. I know, Thea admitted. But if I run, what was the point of everything we did? Sarah studied her for a long moment, then smirked. "You're stubborn? Just like your mom." Thea smiled faintly. She never backed down from a fight. Sarah nodded. "Neither should you?" Thea took a deep breath. "Then I won't." Despite Mercer's arrest, the fight wasn't over. There were still people in power who had benefited from his corruption. Still officials who had looked the other way while he operated in the shadows. And now, with Mercer gone, those shadows were shifting. A man in a dark suit sat in an office overlooking the city, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. He had watched everything unfold from the sidelines, watched Mercer fall, watched the world turn its attention to the trial. But he wasn't worried, because power didn't disappear. It only changed hands. And while Thea, Miles, and Sarah believed they had won, he knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. Thea didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Mercer's conviction would stick, if justice would truly be served, or if another corrupt figure would rise to take his place. But she did know one thing. She wasn't afraid anymore, because the truth had a way of surviving, even in the darkest places. And as long as people like her, like Miles, like Sarah, were willing to stand up and fight for it, the truth would never die. She had been the final witness to Mercer's crimes, but she wouldn't be the last to speak out. Not as long as there was still a world worth saving. 6 months later, the city moved on, as cities always did. Mercer's trial had stretched for weeks, each day uncovering new layers of his crimes. The testimonies had been damning, the evidence overwhelming. Thea had stood in front of the courtroom, her voice steady, her words unshakable as she told the world what had been hidden for so long. She had feared the moment he would look at her, feared the way his eyes would try to reduce her to nothing, the way they had done to so many others before. But when the moment came, Mercer barely met her gaze. He knew. He had lost. The verdict had been swift guilty on all counts. The courtroom had erupted in gasps, in tears, in quiet whispers of justice finally being served. And yet, as Mercer was led away in shackles, Thea felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Miles' article had been published in every major outlet, syndicated across the world. The truth, raw and undeniable, had been laid bare for everyone to see. The headline had been simple: "The Cost of Silence, How One Witness Changed Everything." It wasn't about Mercer. It wasn't about corruption. It was about Thea, about Claire, about every person who had been silenced by power, and every person who had chosen to speak despite the danger. It had been his most read piece in a decade, but for the first time, the recognition didn't matter, because the truth had been told, and that was enough. She stood at the edge of the water, the waves lapping against the shore. Her mother's locket rested in her palm, the metal warm from the sun. For so long, she had been running from the past, from the fear, from the weight of her mother's unfinished fight. Now, for the first time, she wasn't running. She was standing still, letting the world move around her, letting the wind carry away the heaviness in her chest. Sarah had offered her a place in witness protection, a chance to disappear, to start over somewhere far away. But Thea had refused, because running wouldn't change anything. Instead, she had made a different choice. She was staying, to build something new, to make sure that the truth, the real truth, was never buried again. She had already secured a position at an independent investigative journalism firm, using her knowledge and experience to help expose the next Mercer before they could rise to power. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a fighter. In the end, Thea learned something her mother had always known. Truth is a fragile thing, easily hidden, easily silenced. But when someone dares to speak it, when someone refuses to let it die, it becomes unstoppable. It can destroy the most powerful men. It can rebuild a broken world. It can bring justice to the forgotten. And sometimes, it can even set you free. Thea was not just the final witness to a crime. She was the beginning of a movement that would ensure that silence would never win again.